In the early 1820s, a single name struck terror into the hearts of enslaved black people across Maryland's eastern shore and throughout the Chesapeake Bay region. This name appeared in newspaper after newspaper, emblazoned in bold letters with a message as simple as it was horrifying. This man would become the architect of human trafficking in America, transforming the buying and selling of human beings into a modern business enterprise. His methods would be copied by countless others, and his shadow would fall across one of America's most celebrated freedom fighters. His name was Austin Woolfolk, and this is the story of the man who helped build the domestic slave trade into big business. To understand Austin Woolfolk, we first need to understand the world that created him. In 1808, the United States Congress passed a law that was supposed to deal a fatal blow to slavery. The act prohibiting importation of slaves made it illegal to bring enslaved Africans into the country from overseas. Many Americans believed this would be the beginning of the end for the institution of slavery itself. What they didn't anticipate was that this law would actually make slavery more profitable than ever before, just in a different way. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, had already transformed the agricultural landscape of the Deep South. Suddenly, growing cotton was incredibly profitable, and cotton required tremendous amounts of labor to plant, tend, and harvest. The plantations of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama were desperate for workers, but now they couldn't legally import enslaved people from Africa. This created an enormous economic opportunity for anyone willing to step into the gap between supply and demand. In the Upper South, particularly in Maryland and Virginia, the situation was very different. The tobacco economy that had once made these states wealthy was in decline. Farmers were switching to wheat and other crops that required far less labor. This meant that slaveholders in these regions suddenly found themselves with what they coldly referred to as surplus slaves, human beings they no longer needed but were still obligated to feed, clothe, and house. The economic incentive was obvious. Enslaved people could be purchased in Baltimore or Richmond for around $300 and sold in New Orleans for twice that amount or more. This price differential created a massive opportunity for entrepreneurs willing to engage in the business of buying and selling human beings. What was needed was someone with the vision to systematize this trade, to turn it from a haphazard collection of individual transactions into an organized, efficient business. That someone was Austin Woolfolk. Austin Woolfolk was born on September 3, 1796, in the state of Georgia. His family had deep roots in the South, and from an early age, young Austin was exposed to the institution of slavery and the economic opportunities it presented. But his journey to becoming America's most notorious slave trader began not in Georgia, but on the battlefields of the War of 1812. When the British threatened New Orleans in 1814, Woolfolk, then just 18 years old, enlisted in the Tennessee militia alongside his father, Colonel William Woolfolk. The young man served as a lieutenant in the 3rd Battalion, fighting under the command of General Andrew Jackson in what would become one of the most celebrated American military victories of the era. The Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815, was a stunning triumph for American forces. Jackson's ragtag army of frontiersmen, pirates, free black soldiers, and regular troops defeated Britain's elite veterans in just 30 minutes. For young Austin Woolfolk, the victory provided something more than national pride. It provided a glimpse of the fortunes to be made in New Orleans. The city, at the mouth of the Mississippi River, was already becoming the commercial heart of the American South. Cotton, sugar, and other goods flowed down the river from the interior, and New Orleans served as the gateway to international markets. It was also becoming the largest slave market in the United States. A young man with ambition and few scruples could see the potential here. Enslaved people were the most valuable commodity in the South, and New Orleans was where that commodity commanded the highest prices. Woolfolk arrived in Baltimore sometime between 1815 and 1819. The exact date is disputed by historians, but what is certain is that he was remarkably young when he began his career, just 19 years old by some accounts. Baltimore in this period was the third largest city in America, and a major port with extensive shipping connections to New Orleans and other Gulf Coast destinations. It was the perfect location for someone looking to enter the domestic slave trade. In his early days, Woolfolk operated like most slave traders of his time. He worked out of hotels and taverns, meeting with slaveholders who had people to sell and negotiating purchases over drinks. When he had accumulated enough enslaved people, he would chain them together in what was known as a coffle, and march them over 1,000 miles to Georgia, where his uncle John Woolfolk would sell them to local planters. It was brutal, exhausting work, and the profit margins, while good, were limited by how many people one man could move at a time. But Woolfolk was not content to remain a small-time operator. He had bigger visions, and he possessed a gift that would transform him from an ordinary slave trader into something far more significant. Austin Woolfolk understood marketing. In an era before mass media, newspapers were the primary way businesses reached potential customers. Woolfolk recognized that if he wanted to buy enough enslaved people to make serious money, he needed to advertise relentlessly. He began placing ads in every newspaper he could find, not just in Baltimore, but throughout Maryland, Virginia, and beyond. These advertisements were simple, direct, and devastatingly effective. They featured bold headlines and a clear message. His tagline became infamous throughout the region. Like modern-day advertisements for cash-for-gold services, Woolfolk's ads promised immediate payment for human beings. He also styled himself as what he called the justly celebrated, turning his own name into a brand that slaveholders would recognize and trust. This saturation advertising strategy was revolutionary for its time. Previous slave traders had operated more discreetly, conducting their business through personal networks and word of mouth. Woolfolk brought the slave trade out into the open, making it visible and accessible to any slaveholder with human beings to sell. By 1821, Woolfolk had grown successful enough to establish a permanent headquarters. He purchased a whitewashed house on the north side of Pratt Street, at the intersection with what was then called Cove Street. Today, that intersection is where Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard meets Pratt Street, and the site is covered by a highway. But in Woolfolk's time, it was the center of Baltimore's domestic slave trade. Behind the pleasant-looking house, Woolfolk built something far less pleasant. A private jail where he could hold enslaved people until he had accumulated enough to ship south. This was a crucial innovation. Previous traders had either used public jails, which charged fees and were unreliable, or had moved their captives quickly to avoid the expense of housing and feeding them. Woolfolk's private jail allowed him to warehouse human beings like any other commodity, holding them until he had enough to fill a ship. An abolitionist newspaper called The Genius of Universal Emancipation published a description of this facility that captured its horror. The account described small grated windows of his prison in the rear and mentioned chains, fetters, and what it called miserable objects of suffering concealed there, all of which chilled the blood with horror. The jail could hold 40 or more people at a time, packed into cramped cells while they awaited shipment to the Deep South. For the enslaved people held there, the conditions were nightmarish. They had been torn from their families, often without warning or the chance to say goodbye. They knew they were about to be transported far away to work on cotton or sugar plantations under conditions that might well work them to death. The despair was overwhelming. In the spring of 1826, a young woman held in Woolfolk's pen made a choice that captured the desperate horror of her situation. Rather than submit to being sold south, she took her own life and that of her child. In 1821, a man who learned he had been sold to a trader slit his own throat at one of Baltimore's wharves. These were not isolated incidents. They were the human cost of the system Woolfolk was building. But Woolfolk was not building his empire alone. He recognized that to truly dominate the trade, he needed a network. His brothers, Samuel Martin Woolfolk, Joseph Biggers Woolfolk, and Richard Woolfolk, all entered the business alongside him. Two of his uncles, John Woolfolk of Augusta, Georgia, and another Austin Woolfolk, also worked in the trade. This family network extended from Maryland to Georgia to Louisiana, creating a vertically integrated operation that could purchase enslaved people in the Upper South and sell them in the Deep South without relying on middlemen. His uncle, John Woolfolk, established himself in New Orleans and Natchez, Mississippi, running what amounted to a sales agency. He would receive shipments of enslaved people from Austin and Baltimore, sell them to local planters, and remit the proceeds back north. He also acted as a banker of sorts, advancing credit and managing the complex financial transactions that the trade required. This combination of purchasing agents in the Upper South and sales agents in the Lower South gave the Woolfolk operation significant advantages over competitors. The logistics of Woolfolk's operation were carefully planned. Enslaved people were gathered from throughout the region, brought to Baltimore by steamboat from ports along the Chesapeake Bay or by wagon from nearby areas. Once at his Pratt Street headquarters, they were held in the jail until a sufficient number had been accumulated. Then, in the dead of night, Woolfolk would march them through the streets of Baltimore to the docks at Fells Point, where ships waited to carry them south. He conducted these movements at night deliberately, not out of shame but to avoid attracting attention and potential interference. Even in a city that largely accepted the slave trade, there were those who found the sight of chained human beings being marched through the streets disturbing. Working at night minimized complaints while maximizing efficiency. Frederick Douglass, who would become one of America's greatest abolitionists, grew up enslaved in Baltimore during the height of Woolfolk's power. As a child, Douglass lived on Philpott Street in Fells Point, near the wharves where slave ships departed for New Orleans. He would later write about the terror that Woolfolk's name inspired. In his autobiography, Douglass described being awakened in the deep, still darkness of midnight by what he called the dead. Heavy footsteps and the piteous cries of the chained gangs that passed his door. These were Woolfolk's coffles, human beings being driven to the docks for shipment south. The fear of being sold to Woolfolk or someone like him hung over every enslaved person in Baltimore. Douglass wrote that on the Lloyd plantation where he spent part of his childhood, if a slave was convicted of any high misdemeanor, became unmanageable, or showed a determination to run away. He was brought to the main plantation, severely punished, put on board a sloop, carried to Baltimore, and sold to Austin Woolfolk or some other slave trader as a warning to the slaves remaining. Being sold to Woolfolk was the ultimate punishment, a fate considered worse than physical violence because it meant permanent separation from family, friends, and everything familiar. The personal connections between Woolfolk and Douglas's world ran even deeper. Historical accounts indicate that Woolfolk sold at least one of Douglas's relatives, his aunt, into the Deep South trade. This was not unusual. Woolfolk bought and sold thousands of people over his career, and many of them had families who would go on to achieve freedom and prominence. But the knowledge that this particular slave trader had personally trafficked a member of his own family must have given Douglas's later denunciations of the trade a particularly sharp edge. Woolfolk's business model was remarkably sophisticated for its time. He didn't just buy enslaved people randomly. He targeted specific demographic groups that commanded the highest prices in New Orleans. Young adults, particularly men between 18 and 25, were most valuable because they could provide decades of hard labor. Women of childbearing age were also prized because they could produce future generations of enslaved workers. Children could be purchased cheaply and sold at a profit once they grew older. One of his surviving advertisements from a Natchez, Mississippi newspaper in December 1826 gives a sense of his sales operation. The ad announced that he had on hand 75 likely young Virginia-born enslaved people of various descriptions, which he offered to sell low for cash and promised a constant supply through the season. The financial scale of Woolfolk's operation was immense. According to historian Calvin Schermerhorn, who has studied the economics of the domestic slave trade extensively, Woolfolk made tens of thousands of dollars annually in profit, which would translate to hundreds of thousands or even millions in today's currency. By the time of his death, his estate had an economic value equivalent to approximately $200 million in modern terms. This wealth came directly from human suffering, from the broken families and stolen lives of thousands of enslaved people. But Woolfolk operated within a system that not only tolerated his activities, but actively protected them. The legal and political establishment of Baltimore viewed the slave trade as beneficial to the region. Enslaved people were seen as an exportable commodity, and traders like Woolfolk were bringing cash into the local economy. Not everyone approved, of course. From the beginning, Woolfolk faced criticism from abolitionists who recognized the moral horror of what he was doing. One newspaper, Niles's Weekly Register, published in Baltimore, ran a headline in 1821 that screamed "Cash for Blood," directly attacking the slave trade and traders like Woolfolk. Quakers and other anti-slavery activists would sometimes show up at Fells Point to inspect the ships on which Woolfolk's captives were confined, documenting conditions and publicizing the horrors they witnessed. But Woolfolk brushed aside these protests. He had powerful allies in the business community. The shipping companies that transported his human cargo were happy to have his business. The banks that financed his operations saw him as a valuable customer. The merchants who sold the provisions for the voyages south profited from his trade. Slavery in general, and the slave trade in particular, were deeply integrated into Baltimore's economy. The year 1826 was a pivotal one in Woolfolk's career, marked by both triumph and controversy. In April of that year, he sent a shipment of 31 enslaved people aboard the schooner Decatur, bound for New Orleans. What happened next would become one of the most dramatic episodes of resistance in the history of the American slave trade. On the night of April 20th, 1826, the Decatur set sail from Baltimore with its human cargo chained below decks. 5 days into the voyage, the captain, Walter Galloway, made a fatal mistake. Following the common practice of allowing small groups of enslaved people above deck for air and exercise, he was inspecting the ship when he noticed mud on the anchor stocks. He sat astride the rail to scrape it away. 2 of the enslaved people, Thomas Harrod and Manuel Wilson, seized this moment. They rushed the captain, grabbed his legs, and threw him overboard into the sea. The first mate met a similar fate, and suddenly the Decatur was in the hands of its captives. The rebellion had begun. For 5 days, the enslaved people controlled the ship. They demanded that the crew sail them to Haiti, the Caribbean island nation that had won its independence through a successful slave revolution just 2 decades earlier. Haiti represented freedom, a place where former slaves had overthrown their masters and established their own nation. It was the ultimate destination for anyone seeking to escape American bondage. But the enslaved people aboard the Decatur faced a significant problem. They didn't know how to sail the ship, and they had killed the 2 men with the most navigation experience. The vessel drifted along the eastern seaboard, while the remaining crew members, held at the mercy of their former captives, struggled to control it. On May 2nd, a whaling ship called the Constitution encountered the drifting Decatur. Armed sailors from the Constitution boarded and overpowered the rebels, taking 17 of the enslaved people into custody and bringing them to Boston. 3 days later, another ship, the Rook, encountered the Decatur and took the remaining 14 captives to New York. What happened next demonstrated both the courage of the enslaved and the cruelty of the legal system that bound them. Upon arrival in New York, all 14 of the enslaved people who had been taken aboard the Rook managed to escape into the city. New York was a free state, and its large population of free black people provided potential shelter and support for fugitives. Of the 14 who escaped, 13 were never recaptured. They disappeared into the population and presumably into freedom. Their names and ultimate fates remain unknown, but one man was not so fortunate. William Bowser, a 24-year-old who had already attempted to escape from slavery once before, was captured in Westchester, New York, and brought back to face trial for murder. According to reports, Austin Woolfolk himself attended the trial, watching as the man who had dared to resist his power faced justice. What happened in that courtroom has become one of the most remarkable moments in the history of American slavery. William Bowser stood before the court and looked directly at Austin Woolfolk. Then, in an act of extraordinary grace, he spoke. He told the traitor that he forgave him for all the injuries he had brought upon him and expressed hope that they would meet again in heaven. Woolfolk's response was very different. According to witnesses, the slave trader cursed Bowser. On December 15, 1826, William Bowser was executed by hanging on Ellis Island. He died for daring to seek his freedom, while the man who had enslaved him faced no consequences whatsoever. The execution of William Bowser drew the attention of Benjamin Lundy, a Quaker abolitionist who published an anti-slavery newspaper in Baltimore called The Genius of Universal Emancipation. Lundy was horrified by what he had learned about Woolfolk's presence at the trial and his behavior there. He published a scathing article attacking Woolfolk's character, calling him a monster in human shape. The article concluded with a memorable declaration: "Hereafter, let no man speak of the humanity of Woolfolk." Woolfolk was furious. He was accustomed to criticism from abolitionists, but Lundy's attack felt personal, and it was published in his own city, where his reputation mattered. On January 9, 1827, Woolfolk encountered Lundy near the Baltimore post office. What followed was a brutal assault. Woolfolk was 7 inches taller than Lundy and many years younger. The Quaker editor, raised in a tradition of nonviolence, put up no resistance as Woolfolk threw him to the ground, choked him, beat him, and stomped on his head and face. Bystanders had to pull Woolfolk off before he killed the smaller man. Lundy survived the attack and pressed charges. Woolfolk was arrested and put on trial for assault with intent to murder. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of simple assault, and what happened next revealed everything about the power dynamics of antebellum Baltimore. Judge Nicholas Bryce, who presided over the case, was clearly sympathetic to the slave trader. In his ruling, Bryce declared that the trade itself was beneficial to the state, as it removed a great many rogues and vagabonds who were a nuisance. He went on to say that Lundy had deserved his beating, and that but for the strict letter of the law, the court would not fine Woolfolk anything at all. The punishment? $1 plus court costs. For comparison, Woolfolk regularly sold enslaved people for $300 to $400 each. The message was clear. In Baltimore, a slave trader's reputation was worth more than an abolitionist's life. The Woolfolk-Lundy case became a cause célèbre in abolitionist circles. It demonstrated not only the violence that upheld the slave trade, but also the complicity of legal and political institutions in protecting it. A man could nearly beat another man to death in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, and walk away with a fine equivalent to the price of a meal. The case helped radicalize the anti-slavery movement and contributed to the growing conviction among abolitionists that slaveholders and slave traders would never voluntarily give up their human property. But for Woolfolk, life went on essentially unchanged. He continued to operate his business, continued to place his advertisements in newspapers, continued to ship thousands of human beings south to lives of brutal labor. If anything, the trial may have enhanced his reputation among pro-slavery forces as a man willing to defend his business with his fists. Throughout the late 1820s and into the 1830s, Woolfolk remained one of the dominant figures in the Baltimore slave trade. Historian Ralph Clayton, who has studied the Baltimore-New Orleans slave trade extensively, documented at least 71 human shipments by Woolfolk between 1818 and 1846, delivering more than 2,600 enslaved people to New Orleans. The actual number was likely higher, as not all records have survived. Each of these numbers represents a human being torn from their family, transported hundreds of miles, and sold into bondage in the Deep South. Woolfolk's operation was not without its dark ironies. Some of the people he bought had been promised their freedom by their owners, only to see those promises broken. Beverly Dowling was one such victim. He was an enslaved bootblack and entrepreneur who had negotiated with his owner, Sophia Bland, to purchase his freedom for $200 through an installment plan. He had made payments over several years and had his agreement documented in writing. But in 1835, when Dowling arrived to make his final payment, Bland refused to accept it. Instead, she sold him to Austin Woolfolk, who imprisoned him in his Pratt Street jail pending shipment south. Dowling sued for his freedom, and in a rare victory, he won. The court ruled that because Bland had previously allowed him to travel to New York, where he worked as a waiter on a steamboat, he had become legally free under Maryland law. It was a technicality, but it saved his life. Most were not so fortunate. Woolfolk's dominance of the Baltimore slave trade began to wane in the late 1820s and 1830s, but not because of any moral awakening or abolitionist pressure. Instead, he was outcompeted by an even larger and more sophisticated operation. Isaac, Franklin, and John Armfield had been watching Woolfolk's methods, and they learned from them. When they formed their partnership in 1828, they deliberately chose to base their operations in Alexandria, Virginia, partly to avoid direct competition with Woolfolk in Baltimore. But they quickly grew to dwarf his operation. Franklin and Armfield adopted many of Woolfolk's innovations, including aggressive newspaper advertising, a network of purchasing agents, and the use of private jails to warehouse enslaved people. But they took everything further. Their headquarters in Alexandria covered half a city block and included not just a jail but a hospital, a tailor shop where enslaved people were given new clothes before sale, and separate facilities for men and women. They invested in custom-built slave ships that could transport hundreds of people at a time, making the maritime route from the Chesapeake to New Orleans faster and more profitable than ever before. By the mid-1830s, Franklin and Armfield had essentially driven Woolfolk out of the Baltimore market. Some sources say he was pushed out of business entirely by their competition. The reality was more complex. Woolfolk didn't disappear. He evolved. As he aged, he transitioned from active trading to a more executive role, managing his investments and focusing on his growing real estate holdings. He had been acquiring property in Louisiana throughout his career, including what he described as extensive sugar plantations in Iberville Parish. These plantations, worked by enslaved labor, represented a diversification of his investments and a place where he could sell some of his own human cargo rather than relying entirely on the public markets. Woolfolk's later years were spent largely in Louisiana, though he maintained his business connections in Baltimore. In 1839, he married Emily Sparks in Maryland and brought her back to Louisiana, where they would have 4 children, 2 of them adopted. The wedding announcement made no mention of how Woolfolk had made his fortune. By this point, he had largely succeeded in transforming himself from a slave trader into a respectable planter and businessman. His sugar plantation, West Oak, sat along Bayou Grosse Tete, and there he lived the life of a Louisiana gentleman, his wealth built on decades of human trafficking. But his past was never entirely forgotten. In Mississippi in 1933, historian Charles S. Sidner wrote that Woolfolk was a slave trader too famous to require comment. Austin Woolfolk's final journey began in early 1847. He had been suffering from tuberculosis for approximately 2 years, and his condition was deteriorating. Despite being ill and unfit to travel, he was determined to make his way from Baltimore back to his family in Louisiana. Friends advised him against the journey, warning that his body couldn't handle the rigors of travel. Woolfolk ignored them. He had made his fortune moving people across vast distances. Surely he could make this one final trip himself. It was not to be. Woolfolk made it as far as Auburn in Macon County, Alabama, before his body gave out. He died there on February 10, 1847, attended not by his wife and children but by his uncle John Woolfolk, who had been with him in the slave trade from nearly the beginning. He was 50 years old. His obituary, published in newspapers across the South, made no mention of the slave trade that had made him wealthy and infamous. Instead, it praised him as a defender of his country who had fought under General Jackson and mourned him as a devoted family man survived by a wife and 5 children. Woolfolk was buried in Rosedale Cemetery in Iberville Parish, Louisiana. His gravestone bears an inscription noting his military service in the War of 1812, but says nothing of the business that made him rich. His widow, Emily, inherited his properties, including the West Oak plantation, and continued to operate them using enslaved labor. When the Civil War came and slavery ended, she was forced to negotiate contracts with her former slaves, now freedmen, who would work the land for wages. Many of those freedmen were the same people, or the children of people, that Austin Woolfolk had transported from Maryland decades earlier. The physical legacy of Woolfolk's operation in Baltimore has largely disappeared. His slave jail on Pratt Street was demolished long ago, and the site now lies beneath a highway interchange. The site today is occupied by a small park, where homeless encampments offer a grim reminder that human suffering continues in different forms. There is no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate what happened there. For decades, Baltimore largely forgot or ignored its role in the domestic slave trade. Even today, the only official state historical marker in the city noting the slave trade is on East Pratt Street outside the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, far from where the actual jails and pens once stood. But the human legacy of Woolfolk's trade is incalculable. More than 2,600 documented individuals passed through his operation, and the actual number was certainly higher. Each of these people had a story, a family, hopes and dreams that were destroyed when Woolfolk's agents purchased them. Their descendants, if they survived the brutal conditions of the cotton and sugar fields, are scattered across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and beyond. The trauma of family separation, the horror of the coffles and the slave ships, the despair of knowing you would never see your loved ones again. These experiences were passed down through generations in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Austin Woolfolk was a pioneer, but of a terrible kind. He helped transform the domestic slave trade from a disorganized collection of individual transactions into a modern business enterprise. His innovations in advertising, logistics, and vertical integration were copied by countless others and enabled the forced migration of approximately 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. This second Middle Passage, as some historians call it, was one of the largest forced migrations in American history, and Woolfolk was one of its architects. His story is often overshadowed by those of later, larger traders like Franklin and Armfield. But Woolfolk came first. He created the template that others would follow, proved that the slave trade could be big business, and showed that society would protect and reward those who engaged in it. Perhaps the most telling detail about Woolfolk's legacy comes from the company he kept in death. When the Georgetown University Jesuits sold 272 enslaved people to Louisiana planters in 1838, some of those people ended up on plantations near Woolfolk's own West Oak. By 1861, Emily Woolfolk, Austin's widow, owned the West Oak plantation outright, and records show that some of the people on her property had originally been sold by the Maryland Jesuits. The connections between slavery, religion, education, and commerce ran deep in antebellum America, and Woolfolk's operation touched all of them. The question of how to remember Austin Woolfolk is complicated. He was, by any modern standard, a monster. He made his fortune by tearing families apart, by treating human beings as commodities, by facilitating unspeakable cruelty. But he was also a product of his time, operating within a legal framework that not only permitted but encouraged his activities. Judge Bryce's ruling that the slave trade was beneficial to the state was not an aberration, but a reflection of mainstream opinion in antebellum Maryland. Woolfolk did not create the system of slavery. He merely exploited it with unusual efficiency and ruthlessness. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation. Understanding how men like Woolfolk could operate openly, could be celebrated by some and protected by the law, helps us understand how slavery persisted for so long and why its abolition required a civil war. The complicity was not limited to a few bad actors but permeated entire societies, from judges and politicians to merchants and ship captains, from newspaper editors who ran the advertisements to housewives who purchased the cotton that enslaved people produced. Woolfolk was the visible face of a system that involved millions of Americans. Frederick Douglass, who as a child heard the coffles pass his door in the darkness, would go on to become one of the most powerful voices against slavery in American history. He spoke and wrote about the horrors of the trade with first-hand knowledge, having lived in its shadow and lost family members to its machinery. In his famous 4th of July speech in 1852, Douglass specifically mentioned Baltimore's slave trade, referencing the business conducted at the head of Pratt Street, where Woolfolk's jail had stood. For Douglass, men like Woolfolk represented not just personal evil, but systemic cruelty. A nation that proclaimed liberty while treating millions of its people as property to be bought and sold. Today, as we reckon with the legacy of slavery in America, figures like Austin Woolfolk deserve renewed attention. He was not a peripheral figure in American history, but a central one, a man who helped build an institution that shaped the nation's development and whose consequences we are still living with. The wealth generated by the slave trade helped finance industrialization in the North and expansion in the South. The trauma inflicted on enslaved families has echoed through generations. The racial inequalities that persist today have roots in the system that Woolfolk helped perfect. His story is uncomfortable, as it should be. It forces us to confront the reality that slavery was not maintained by a few villains, but by an entire economy, an entire society, that chose profit over human dignity. When we look at Austin Woolfolk, we see not just one man, but a mirror reflecting truths about America that we would often prefer to ignore. At the site where his slave jail once stood, beneath a highway overpass in Baltimore, there is nothing to mark what happened there. No plaque commemorates the thousands who passed through in chains. No memorial honors those who chose death over sail into the deep South. No monument acknowledges the children separated from parents, the husbands torn from wives, the communities destroyed by Woolfolk's trade. Perhaps that should change. Perhaps the absence of memory is itself a kind of continuing injustice, an erasure of suffering that allows us to pretend the past didn't happen, or that it happened somewhere else, to someone else. Austin Woolfolk's name may be largely forgotten today, but his legacy lives on in the descendants of those he trafficked, in the wealth inequalities that persist between races, in the ongoing struggle to reckon with America's original sin. When William Bowser stood on the gallows on Ellis Island in December 1826, he looked at the man who had enslaved him and offered forgiveness. Woolfolk cursed him in return. That exchange captures something essential about the moral universe of American slavery: the dignity of the oppressed, the depravity of the oppressor, and the yawning gulf between them. Bowser sought heaven. Woolfolk sought profit. History has rendered its own judgment on both men, even if the courts of their time could not. And now, nearly 2 centuries later, it falls to us to remember what happened in those midnight streets, in those cramped cells, on those ships bound for New Orleans, to remember the human beings who were treated as cargo, to remember and to resolve that such horrors must never happen again.